I just realized I was muted for the past like couple of minutes. See, this is why I love I love going live. The theater person me is coming out today. We're gonna start over again. Hello everyone. Thank you all for joining us for episode 18 of season 3 of Black Writers Read. My name is Nicole Young Martin and I'm the founder, producer, and host for the series. We've arrived at the last live stream of season 3. I can't believe I'm saying that aloud. I typed it in the script earlier today and I was just like, oh, okay. And then saying it aloud, I'm like, oh, yeah, it's happening. So we do have some things going on this summer. And the thing that we have going on this summer is our first annual virtual summer book club. We're starting with poetry, Enzo Salon Soren's American Scapegoat. He was on a couple of episodes ago. We will gather on Zoom on June 25th at 1 o'clock to chat with the author about this amazing book. For more information on the book club and to sign up, please visit Black Writers Read on Instagram or visit my website at NicoleMYoung.com/projects/Black Writers Read. It's here on the screen. Also, be sure to share it throughout the episode. I would love to see many of you join us for the book clubs this summer. Again, the first one is in a couple of weeks. Also, make sure to purchase the book and purchase it soon so that you have it in enough time to read. Let's go ahead and get started with today's episode because there's so much amazing things that are going to be happening today with today's guest. Black Writers Read showcases, celebrates, and honors the words, work, and traditions of Black writers from across the country, across genres, across experiences, and across the African diaspora. Black Writers Read is a behind-the-scenes conversation into the craft and what it means to create as a Black author in today's society. Since starting the series during the summer of 2020, we've hosted over 50 authors representing various genres, including children's books, young adult fiction, poetry, urban creative nonfiction, memoir, history, horror, essays, food, and culture from around the globe, including Western Massachusetts, Maryland, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., Florida, upstate New York, New York's Hudson Valley, Philadelphia, Vermont, Cambridge, Massachusetts, Chicago, Virginia, Indiana, Portugal, Costa Rica, and St. Martin. Today, we welcome Dr. Kimberly Mack. Kim Mack will begin her time as the Associate Professor of English at University of Illinois, Urbana, Champaign this coming fall. Her book, Living Colors Time's Up, part of Bloomsbury's 33 and a Third book series, was published in May of 2023. She is also the author of Fictional Blues, Narrative Self Invention, From Bessie Smith to Jack White. I'm a huge fan of Jack White. Published by the University of Massachusetts Press in 2020, which won the 2021 College English Association of Ohio's Nancy Dasher Award. Kim is writing another book tentatively titled The Untold History of American Rock Criticism about the BIPoC and White women writers who helped develop American rock criticism and journalism during the 1960s and 70s. Kim holds a Ph.D. in English from UCLA and an M.F.A. in creative writing from Antioch University Los Angeles, and she has received fellowships and scholarships to attend writing residencies at the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts, Vermont Studio Center, and the Bread Loaf Writers Conference. Kim is a memorialist and music writer, and her scholarly and public-facing articles and essays have appeared in African American Review, Popular Music and Society, Journal of Popular Music Studies, AMP, American Music Perspectives, Longreads, No Depression, and elsewhere. Today, Kim will read an excerpt from her latest book, Living Colors Time's Up. The iconic Black rock band Living Colors Time's Up, released in 1990, was recorded in the aftermath of the spectacular critical and commercial success of their debut record, Vivid. Time's Up is a musical and lyrical triumph, incorporating distinct forms and styles of music and featuring inspired collaborations with artists as varied as Little Richard, Queen Latifah, Messiah Parker, and Mick Jagger. The clash of sounds and styles don't immediately fit. The confrontational hardcore thrash metal, complete with Glover's apocalyptic maul, and the title track is not a natural companion with Dougie Fresh's human beatbox on tag team partners, but it's precisely this bold and brilliant collision that creates the barely controlled chaos. And isn't rock and roll about chaos? Living Color's sophomore effort holds great relevance in light of its forward-thinking politics and lyrical engagement with racism, classism, police brutality, and other social and political issues of great importance. I have a question to Kim later about this, but do a lot of these topics sound familiar 30 years later? Through interviews with members of Living Color and others involved in the making of Time's Up, Kimberly Mack explores the creation and reception of this artistically challenging album while examining the legacy of this culturally important and groundbreaking American rock band. For those who are new to Black Writers Read, here's the format of our show. Kim will read from Time's Up, then we will chat about her book and her prolific writing career. If time remains at the end of the conversation, we'll open it up to question and answer for those who are joining us today. We have viewers joining us from both Facebook and YouTube. If you have a question, please feel free to include it in the comment section on the platform where you are joining us from today. I will compile the questions and either pose them to our guests following our conversation or insert them during an appropriate time within our chat. I'd now like to bring Kim onto the virtual stage. Hello.
Hello.
So great to finally have you on because I think you and Bloomsbury reached out to us a couple of months ago.
So happy to be here, and thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, and congratulations on the release of Time's Up. And I saw that you're doing really well on the interview circuit as well for the book.
Yeah, no, it's been great. I've been able to go on a book tour that's taken me across the country. I've been to New York. I'm going to Los Angeles at the end of June. And in between, I'm located right now in Toledo, Ohio. So I've been able to go places that are drivable. Also went to Chicago. So yeah, it's been quite a fun stretch here of getting to talk about my book with smart people.
Nice. And I also saw you went to my hometown of Detroit a couple of weeks ago.
Yep. I was at Page's Bookshop.
Nice. And so for those who may have heard it, I do live next to a train track. You may have heard the train going in the background. From me being muted to the train, this is one of the things that makes Black Writers Read amazing. So Kim, the stage is yours. Have fun reading.
Okay, here we go. All right, so hi everyone. Yes, today I'm going to talk about my new book, Living Color's Time's Up, focused on Grammy-winning Black rock band Living Color's sophomore effort Time's Up and part of the 33 1/3 book series, offering short books about albums. For Time's Up, I interviewed all of the current members of Living Color, as well as ex-member Muzz Skillings. I also spoke to various members of the record's production crew, its producer, engineer, and more, and the late legendary cultural critic Greg Tate. Time's Up includes a mix of biography, oral history, memoir, and cultural criticism. In the big picture, just to give you a general sense of what I do, my research and writing is multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary, focusing on the connections between 20th and 21st century African-American literature and American popular music. And I'm specifically interested in how people, fictional and real, use narratives, stories and storytelling to reclaim and assert power and agency. And I'm particularly interested in Black people's stories and how they shift fictive ideas that circulate in American culture about popular music and the artists who create these works. So Living Color emerged at the end of the 1980s, and because of the segregated nature of the record industry, with artists tethered to strict race-based musical categories and the resistance that Black rockers sometimes faced from both white rock audiences and skeptics in the Black community, Living Color's success was entirely unexpected. Their 1988 release, Vivid, was eventually certified double platinum and reached number 6 on the US Billboard 200 chart. The single, Cult of Personality, made it to number 13 on the Billboard Hot 100 chart and number 9 on the Billboard Mainstream Rock Airplay chart. Cult of Personality won a Grammy for Best Hard Rock Performance. Vivid was also well-reviewed, with publications like Rolling Stone and the New York Times showering the album and the band with praise. Living Color won a second consecutive Grammy Award for the album Time's Up, which is the one I wrote about here, in 1991. And they accomplished all of this in an industry that was indifferent to rock artists who looked like them until somebody realized that there was money to be made. So now I'm going to shift to reading some of the personal narrative in my book. This is an excerpt from chapter 3. The title of the chapter is Pride, Rock and Roll, Living Color, and Me. It was a late Sunday afternoon in 1978, and I was 9. I sat in my Bed-Stuy Brooklyn kitchen, watching the large, battered stainless steel pot as it heated up on our equally battered and now yellowed with time stove. I eyed my grandmother, still dressed in her church clothes, while she stood watch nearby. She glanced at me, and I looked back, uneasily. And then I quickly returned my focus to the blue flame that reached up and up, ever closer to the sides of the pot. I had never seen the burner set so high. Kimberly, be careful with the burner, keep it low, my mom would always tell me. My grandmother was humming to herself, which she often did, especially after church. I didn't recognize the song, but the words Lord and Jesus stood out. My mother was in our bedroom, having been chased there by my grandmother just minutes before. My mom had used the full weight of her 5'2" 100-pound body to hold the door closed tight as my grandmother pulled and pulled, using her own 5 foot and much heavier body. You stupid bitch, my mom taunted from behind the door. Get the fuck out of my house, my grandmother shot back. Even though the words were familiar, my mom and I lived with my grandmother out of my financial necessity, and the two had some version of the same argument over and over again. They never lost their sting. I would flinch when my grandmother told my mom to leave, because that included me too. I looked away from the flame and saw my mom. She had come out of her room and was facing me. I held my breath. Why did I know it was coming while she did not? It didn't seem right. Before I could release my breath, my grandmother had pulled the pot off the stove and was hurling the boiling hot water at my mother. My mother was gone like a shot, and the water barely connected, but I was terrified. I grew up in a violent family. It was rage expressed in angry words and satiated in the completion of physical abuse. Grievances settled with a fist in a face or boiling water flung at a body. My mother and grandmother circled each other, two women, now both long gone, who were probably too much alike to have ever had the chance to coexist peacefully. My mother, having been physically and emotionally abused by her mother as a child and well into adulthood, was always braced for a fight, even though she did everything in her power to shy away from them. After divorcing my father when I was 3, she stayed single until I was 12 to avoid getting hit. In her mind, all men hit eventually. When my mother shared the same space with my grandmother, even for fleeting minutes, all bets were off. These two equally broken and strong-willed women fought almost every time they crossed paths, which was daily. I didn't know it then, but I internalized this violence and made myself small in order to make my mother's life easier. But I was also angry. When I said before that I grew up in a violent family, that was all true, but that doesn't tell the whole story. I also grew up in a musical family. My mother, grandmother, aunt, and uncles weren't professional musicians, but music was always there. My mother had a beautiful voice, and she sang all the time, around the house, to me, and later in the church choir when I was a teenager. As the story goes, when my mother was young, she was singing in a girl group that was good enough to have advanced far in a local talent show. In order to move forward to the next stage, she needed a nice dress, and my grandmother was unsupportive, insisting that my mother couldn't, quote, sing anyway, unquote. Yet music was at the center of my grandmother's world too. She sang along all day to a soundtrack that only she could hear. Sometimes she sang recognizable songs, and other times she hummed melodies without words. I was always happy to hear my grandmother singing, not due to the singing itself, but because usually when she sang, that meant that she had lost interest in whatever battle was occurring between her and my mom, or she might be in too much of a good mood to fight. None of that was predictable, though. Listening to music was also a value in our home, with my mother devouring rock music and influencing me to do the same. Rock offered a way for me to channel my quiet rage, and Living Colors Time's Up was the perfect sonic vehicle. I grew up loving U2, Squeeze, and Blondie, while also enjoying Led Zeppelin, Cheap Trick, Van Halen, and other hard rock bands, but their music didn't quite hit the same way as Living Colors. There are likely many reasons for this, but chief among them was that Living Color rocked hard, and they looked like me. Hearing Time's Up, the song, and the rest of Time's Up, the album, in 1990 was one of the earliest moments where I felt joy in the aggression itself, theirs and mine. I have no idea how many times I've listened to the track Time's Up, but each time I do, I'm struck by how powerful, exciting, heavy, moving, and immediate it remains. As soon as I hear the clocks in the insistent ticking that grows louder and louder, I find myself waiting rapt, for the snap, snap, snap of Will Calhoun's drums. He hits those drums like he's mad at them, and I get it. The band has always talked about their love and admiration for Bad Brains, and Time's Up is a clear homage. It was also the fulfillment of Corey Glover's longtime love for hardcore and desire to sing a hardcore or punk rock song. And Time's Up certainly fits the bill. It has the blinding speed and sledgehammer aggression of Bad Brains' Sailing On and Don't Need It, and the ingenious changes and unexpected melody of Band in DC. I always appreciate the changes in this song. The move from the furious hardcore with Skillings' simultaneously rhythmic and melodic, muscular and delicate bass line, and Calhoun's lightning fast drumming to a slowed down, funkier rock song. It's unexpected, but feels right every time. Real talk. I didn't grow up in an Afrocentric home. I want to be clear that I was reared in a family of proud Black people, including numerous Black women who modeled independence for me. And during the 1970s, when I was 7 or 8, my mother gifted me with the Black Book, a chronicle of Black American history from 1969 to 1940s. But my mother did not allow me to watch Roots on TV because she was certain that it would scare me and inform my worldview. In other words, she was concerned that I would grow up to be afraid of white people, which certainly didn't align with her plans for my successful assimilation into mainstream white culture. I might go so far as to label my mother a feminist, but given that many of the feminists she admired were white women, our bodies ourselves was a staple in our home, it is fair to say that it was not an intersectional brand of feminism. And all of this converges with the other message I didn't get growing up, that rock is Black. My mother and I were passionate fans of rock, but I was never explicitly told where the music came from. She played Jimi Hendrix, then Lizzie, and Garland Jeffries in our home, but mostly without political comment. So in 1990, my engagement, or lack thereof, with the next two songs on the album is reflective of these aspects of my upbringing. When I first heard History Lesson, and for years afterward, with its invocation of Africa, I would fast forward. This was in the days of cassette tapes, to get to the part that rocks. Of course, 32 years later, my education, formal and informal, in Black American history has reshaped my interests and views, but my history behind History Lesson is important as it shows why Living Color has made such an impact on me and my musical development. On Will Calhoun's song Pride, Reed's guitar riff is big. On an album featuring propulsive guitar on multiple hard rock songs, this riff is particularly memorable. The drums are heavy and Glover's voice is thunderous, while Skillings' bass line is unobstructive and mellifluous. Don't ask me why I play this music, because it's my culture, so naturally I use it. I state my claim to say, it's here for all to play. These lyrics struck a chord from the moment I first heard it. I was unsure of myself. I thought rock was white. Living Color gave me permission to love this music and to embrace it as my own. Time's Up, History Lesson, and Pride together set the tone for a record that is stylistically ambitious. While on the surface it appears that its greatest strength is its ability to engage multiple genres and forms, what Living Color also does well on this record is demonstrate that these genres and forms are malleable, permeable, and in many cases fictional. As Reed states, quote, "Before the genres ossified and became rules you had to follow, there was a huge amount of freedom, and bands had their stance right and did their thing," unquote. Skillings adds an important twist. Some critics who mention Living Color's eclecticism use the term to undermine their legitimacy as rockers. But importantly, as Skillings notes, Living Color's genre bending is not about the dilution of rock or seeking to create a fusion. Quote, "I was very conscious of the norms at the time and made very conscious, well-informed effort to expand the rock genre itself a bit at the time, while never violating the accepted rules of what rock was then. We pushed the boundaries by rocking through the boundaries," unquote. Okay, and here's one more section from chapter 3. Like many other rock-loving little girls in 1979, at the height of Blondie's commercial success, Debbie Harry was my hero, and like most everyone else in that time period, I was in awe of her beauty. I loved Blondie's music, but I also spent a lot of time staring at Debbie's face on album covers and in rock magazines and glossy color books. I wondered how someone could have such perfect cheekbones and pouty full lips while also seeming like she didn't care one bit about her face or her body. How could someone look like a classic Hollywood movie star while on stage contorting her body awkwardly as she danced with wild abandon. Her physical beauty attracted me, but also repelled me because the elements of her face that made her an object of admiration and lust were elements that would, as a young Black girl, elude me. My hair was not straight, my skin was not porcelain white. My face was not simultaneously angular and soft with just the right accentuation of the cheekbone. Debbie's beauty reminded me of what I was not. This did not inhibit my passionate and abiding fandom for her and her band, but it kept me at a distance in much the same way I negotiated the gulf between the white male rock stars I crushed on and myself. While I sat on my living room couch, Oh Caroline by Cheap Trick on the turntable, I fantasized that I was Caroline and Robin Zander was talking to me. Oh Caroline, my life shined when you walked in. But I had already gotten the message that that would only be possible if I were a white girl. So when I closed my eyes pretending to be Caroline, I would still be me, only I would flip my hair, my cornrowed braids, the way the white girls on TV and at my prep school in Brooklyn Heights did. I never questioned any of this. Growing up in 1970s Brooklyn, rock stars were white, the women they celebrated and derided in equal measure were white, and rock music itself was white. The music I loved the most was not for me. Sure, I was free to listen to it, but I was constantly reminded when I read Cream and Rolling Stone, and later when I started going to rock shows, that I was an interloper. On a cold evening in February 1981, I attended my first rock show with my mom, Cheap Trick at Radio City Music Hall in Manhattan. I was 11. My mom used a ticket broker to score center floor seats about 15 rows back. Cheap Trick was one of my favorite bands, second only to Blondie. I was obsessed with the four men from Rockford, Illinois. I played both Cheap Trick at Budokan and Dream Police nonstop at home. I knew that they were an acclaimed live rock band, one of those bands who spent many of their pre-fame years on the road, honing their touring chops in small clubs because Rolling Stone magazine had told me so. They did not disappoint. Singer Robin Zander, known as a man of 1,000 voices, thrilled the crowd with his alternatively soft crooning and always in tune aggressive screaming, and guitarist Rick Nielsen showcased his impressive range of now iconic heavy rock riffs. As it was my first concert, I spent as much time looking around at the audience as I did focusing on the spectacle on stage. I immediately noticed that I didn't see another Black face besides mine and my mom's, and it was not for lack of trying. I searched and searched. It didn't take long for the discomfort and self-consciousness to kick in. As the concert continued, I was sure that people were staring at us. I became distracted, lost in thought, as the band I'd been dreaming about seeing live for so long stood before me. I loved the music more than anything, but I wasn't sure if I was supposed to be there. I wasn't sure if the music was for me. A little more than halfway through the show, Cheap Trick played their cover of Fats Domino's rock and roll classic, Ain't That a Shame. I knew Fats Domino was Black, and I figured most of the audience did too. This was a tiny opening that helped me to feel a little bit less like an outsider. Hearing that song made me happy, but the feeling was fleeting. As much as I enjoyed my first rock show, it was the second one that helped me to fall in love with live rock performance. On a hot, sticky July evening in 1981, July 17, 1981 to be exact, I saw Van Halen at Madison Square Garden. I had turned 12 a month earlier. I stood next to my mom, wide-eyed, peering down at the band from the balcony stage left, as absolute rock and roll chaos unfolded in front of us. Van Halen began their set, as they often did in their early shows, with On Fire from their self-titled debut. This underrated hard rock classic features a catchy and, of course, heavy guitar riff by the late Eddie Van Halen and the highest of high falsetto vocals by singer David Lee Roth and bassist Michael Anthony in the chorus. All night, Roth prowled the stage, the embodiment of rock and roll swagger, in impossibly tight gray satin pants and a ripped white t-shirt. That is when he wasn't shirtless. There was an endless parade of solos, bass solos, drum solos, and of course, Eddie was Eddie, a god with a guitar, to the delight of the rhapsodic crowd. At one point during the show, Roth, ever the showman, emerged from backstage with his oversized blue ice cream bar guitar for his cover of Chicago bluesman John Brem's song, Ice Cream Man. That image is forever seared into my brain. But once again, as I looked at the audience to my left and my right and across the arena, I saw a sea of whiteness. The only Black people I witnessed were staff members working as ushers or manning the concession stands. So I continued to believe that rock was white. I loved it, and my mom did too. It spoke to me like no other music could. But when I played my records at home, I was always worried our neighbors might hear, and I feared they would judge me. I know now what I did not know then. Rock is black, evolving out of the blues and later rhythm and blues. Rock and roll, circa 1950s to early 1960s, had a black face, with artists like Chuck Berry and Little Richard and Fats Domino and Big Joe Turner and Laverne Baker leading the way. Yet as rock and roll gave way to rock, it became associated with whiteness, with Elvis, the British Invasion Acts, and later Led Zeppelin, appropriating and regurgitating Black American music back to young white fans. At that time, I had certainly heard of Jimi Hendrix. My mom wouldn't stop talking about him, but he had been gone for more than a decade. I was a 1-year-old when he died. My mother also told me stories about Black singer-songwriter Arthur Lee and his Los Angeles-based rock band Love, who never enjoyed the success that they deserved. Phil Lynott was also Black and alive and important. He was the frontman for Thin Lizzy, an internationally successful hard rockin' crew from Dublin, Ireland. But Dublin, particularly in 1978, when my mom would play Dancing in the Moonlight on the living room stereo, might as well have been on the moon. So, even if these Black artists demonstrated that rock music wasn't the exclusive purview of white men, where were the Black fans when I went to concerts? Thank you. So, Nicole, you are muted.
Thank you. Yeah, because I had a coughing fit. So I was like, let me make sure I'm muted during it. And I just keep muting myself today. Maybe I shouldn't talk today. But one of the things I was mentioning when I was muted was this is one of the reasons why Black Writers Read is as expansive as it is, because we love talking with folks who represent multiple different experiences of the Black experience, because the Black experience is not just one thing. I remember when I first created Black Writers Read, I specifically said I want it to be specifically across genres, across experiences, and that experiences is extremely broad. So I totally didn't realize, because I have a question about this, like how personal Living Colors album was for you until really preparing for your interview. So I just want to first start off by thanking you for writing this book and writing it from such a personal perspective.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that. Yeah, I mean, this is a record that means a lot to me. So there really was no avoiding being personal while writing it.
Yeah, and I really hope that, and also too, and I'm learning more about criticism now, but it's like I really hope that more critics step outside of the ivory tower and start engaging with the eye, because we have a reason why we approach and write about and want to write about certain things, which is keeping it to the surface of the product. I'm like, I know there's a personal reason within that. So I appreciate the narrative that you constructed for this particular project.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, so I agree. I mean, this is so in academia, and I do think this is slowly changing. I think there's been a bit of a turn, particularly in the humanities. I can only really speak to the humanities, and an understanding that this generation of scholars, and I think, earlier ones too, I think everyone's kind of realizing that in order for people to understand what we do in the humanities, because that's been kind of somewhat demonized by a lot of people for all kinds of reasons. But in order for people to understand how important the humanities are and how useful they are, really delving deeply into what makes us all human and doing this through culture, as one example, is we have to get this work out to people in the public, right? I mean, if we're writing things that we're really only going to be talking to each other in the academy and having a few hundred people read our work, or maybe, and I might be being generous there, that's not really doing the work of showing, the rest of our culture and the rest of our country how important the humanities is. So a step towards that, I think, is writing accessibly. I believe it's possible to write rigorous, intelligent, well-researched scholarship while also writing in a way that's readable and interesting. And it should be, I think, work that any, intelligent, interested person can connect to. I personally believe that. And I think that more and more people are believing that. And then, as you said, historically, the idea was that we should be 100% objective and always really distanced from our scholarship. But I don't think that ever was real or true. No one spends, well, I can only speak to like English, where we spend 7, sometimes 8 years, sometimes more years on the Ph.D. Nobody is spending all that time thinking about those problems or lines of inquiry because they're distanced from the work. People are spending that kind of effort and time because they feel connected somehow. So why pretend, So I think there is a turn. There are people who are bringing the eye into their scholarship. And in terms of like music criticism, there's definitely been for quite a while a turn towards bringing in the personal narrative into the cultural criticism. And we've had people like Hanif Abdurraqib and Daniel Smith and Ann Powers and all kinds of people who've been doing this for quite a long time. So, I'm just kind of joining that group of people.
Nice. And then also before we launch into the questions, I think too, because I have a little foot in the very little foot still in the humanities, is that it's so important for us of marginalized communities to write from the I, because so much of criticism is written on us from outsiders. And so that centering the I is just so important because it is a first person account of a particular cultural experience.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And particularly in popular music studies, there's just been quite a very long history of, and mostly white men, but like white folks writing about Black music, which is, a lot of the popular music is Black music, across these different categories of music. And historically, it has been white men writing about it. And there's some wonderful books out there and wonderful writers who've done this work for a long time and have done great and careful and thoughtful work. But, it's also important for Black folks in popular music studies. And I have my foot in 2 different disciplines. My PhD's in English, but my scholarship is in literary studies and also popular music studies. And that started with my dissertation, which is a very multidisciplinary dissertation. And I had a committee member who's my second reader in musicology. And I, did hours in musicology also and, did classes there. So my work has been, I've published in both. I publish in English, I publish in popular music studies. So I'm invested in both. So when I talk about popular music studies, it's coming from a very personal perspective here. And, it is important. And in recent years, we are having more and more books, and particularly by Black women, popular music studies scholars. And I'm thinking of people like Regina Bradley and Daphne Brooks. And Shauna Redmond and others who are just really, really, and Maureen Mann, who are just out there writing these books on popular music. And many of those books are kind of reclamation projects or counter narrative type projects, which is what I'm most interested in. So, so yeah, it's important. And again, when you're doing that kind of work, how can you avoid the I?
Nice. And speaking of the I, and I love that you gave a shout out to Daphne Brooks. I went to a talk of hers at UMass when I was working on my master's, and I was just I fell in love with her work, and I need to re-engage with her. So,
Mm-hmm.
but we're finally launching into the formal questions, and so much has already been shared. So the first question, and you've answered a lot of this, but I would love for you to share a little bit more detail. Um, excuse me, more in terms of the origin story of Living Colors, Time's Up. What inspired you to write about it at this time in your career?
Yeah. So, as I was reading, this is a band that it went beyond just enjoying them musically, which I did and do. And by the way, just for the record, they are still together and touring right now. So I just want everyone to know that they're an ongoing concern. But it wasn't just musical love for this band. It's also just how important they were to, as I said in my reading, my own musical development, how much they taught me about really my own history and how much they inspired me to want to learn more about my own history. So I feel like they were not only a band that were just incredible and kind of knocked me on my ass when I first heard them and woke me up, but also they're like teachers for me. So when I was thinking about doing a book for this series, and ever since I saw that this series existed in the early part of the 2000s, it became a bucket list thing for me. I just wanted to be part of this series. It's such a cool series. And what I love about this series of books is that there's just like a lot of latitude for like how people can approach the books, so you've got these super personal, a lot of people write, personal narratives, interspersed between the cultural criticism. But also some people have written books in this series as like just like a novella. People have written, like just kind of straight cultural criticism. People have, of course, brought all kinds of personal things. So I just really, really appreciated just the wide range of how people approach this series. So as soon as I decided, yeah, I'm going to do a book in this series, I knew it was going to be Living Color. And I thought about Living Color. And then I was thinking about what record. And the most obvious would be the first one. Because, that's a story. They were an all Black rock band emerging in the late 80s and this is back when the music industry was capital M, capital I. It's not that anymore. So it's important to kind of set that context so people understand just how important this band is and what they accomplished, because this was when gatekeeping was hard. Like it was like serious gatekeeping and across color line type situation gatekeeping. And rock was, the ascendant form of music at that time. Like rock was what was on the top of the charts and MTV and dominating MTV, right? And so, and we all know how hard it was for Black artists to get played on MTV, period, right? Like there's been like a lot of discussion about that. So this was a rock band who were all Black, who were trying to get on rock radio, who were trying to get an MTV, who were trying to get signed, who were trying to have all these things happen. And it was an uphill battle. And it wasn't just an uphill battle from, the white dominated record industry. There were also Black folks who also didn't understand what they were doing and wondered why they were doing this music. Because this fictional narrative of rock being white was something that was so successful, right? That I think everybody bought into it. And I certainly, as I said, as a kid, didn't know any better. So you can't, Vivid seems like a really obvious choice. So I do spend time in this Time's Up book in the introduction talking about all of that lead up to Time's Up. But I chose to write about Time's Up because, well, first of all, I think this record is a masterpiece. It is their second record, and sometimes people make assumptions that the second record isn't going to be as good as the first, especially when the first record did so well. But it's just the opposite here. Like, this record is, I think, a better record. You know, the first one was a very mainstream rock record that was really legible to people who like metal, people who like hard rock. It had Cult of Personality on it, which was a massive hit, which, you know, if you don't think you know the song Cult of Personality, you know the song Cult of Personality. You just need to hear it, hear that riff or hear the chorus, and you'll recognize, oh, I do know it. I mean, it was played at the series ending episode of Walking Dead. It's still circulating in popular culture. So, you know, that record, I think, was just like really, you know, easy for like rock fans to latch on to. The second record, though, was more experimental, bolder. It crossed all kinds of categories and genres of music, sometimes in the same song. The lyrical content, and I'll say one more thing about that. I think all of that moving between different categories and not doing that, as Muzz Skillings and I talked about, to move away from rock, but really to expand what people's ideas about rock are. All of that, I think, did anticipate where we are now. You know, the ways that young people listen to music with, you know, playlists, right? Like, people are moving between these categories in the way that they were not in the 1980s or early 90s when this band was first emerging. So musically, you know, more interesting, but also lyrically, this is a band who really expanded their palette from the first record. They were always a political band. They were always talking about racism and classism and police brutality and gentrification. But this record includes other things too, like the environment. Time's Up, that first song, is a wake-up call about the environment. In 1990, a hardcore song about the environment, that was not a thing. You know, and they did that. And, you know, it has songs on there about love, right? And death. Corey Glover's dad died just before they started to hit it big. And Solace of You is about his father. The ending song is this really philosophical song, This Is the Life, about, you know, appreciating the life you have. And then they had songs that were like forward thinking on there, like Information Overload, which is really kind of predicting, it's about the information age, right? It's about computers and stuff, but it's really predicting kind of the chaos of social media and the internet in 1990. And then, you know, finally, I will say that the song Elvis is Dead and Pride are two more songs that really engage this reclamation of rock as Black. And this is something that Living Colour was doing when they came on the scene, and doing really, really well, and doing it, you know, at a time when no one was doing that. You know, no one was thinking in those ways. I mean, to be fair, there were writers who wrote about them, who talked about the weirdness of having to engage them as a Black rock band, because it was such a big deal. I mean, you know, their visibility when they came out was, you know, equal parts about the music, but also about their race, you know, because people were just like, wow, oh my God, a Black rock band, right? And there were some writers who would say, this is ridiculous. Of course, you know, we know the origins of rock, but here we are. But many other writers weren't doing that. So both Pride, which is in part about this reclamation of rock music, don't ask me why I play this music, it's my culture, so naturally I use it, you know, is also about kind of predicting where we are now, because it's talking about, the chorus is history's a lie that they teach you in school, a fraudulent view called the golden rule, right? So Will Calhoun, the drummer who wrote the song, was also engaging the limitations of, you know, the educational system in the United States for Black kids and kids of color in general. So yeah, and then Elvis is Dead, right, is also a song that's reclaiming rock as Black, and an ingenious song because it has Little Richard, who is an architect of rock and roll, right, on this track about Elvis, who, is kind of like an exemplar of cultural appropriation. And then you have Mick Jagger, who of the Rolling Stones, who did end up, helping the band get signed eventually, who's one of the voices in the breakdown saying Elvis is dead. And of course, Mick Jagger is someone else who's been, seen as an exemplar of appropriation, but also somebody at the very least who has benefited, right, from rock and roll, Black rock and rollers and blues people saying that. So this is a band who just like, oh my gosh, like does so much in this record. So for me, and this is a very long answer, I realize it, but for me, it was a no-brainer that this was the album. Like, this is the one to talk about. This is the bold, exciting, different, confident record. And then how do we get from Vivid to that? And what's that story? And what's the story of a band who's coming off that kind of success and what they do next? So I knew that it was going to be this record.
So this is a great segue into a question, excuse me, about the influence on culture. And also too, like this album came out 23 years ago?
33 years
Oh yeah,
ago.
33. Yeah. And I'm like, I don't know why I keep thinking the 90s was only 20-some years. I don't know. I'm like,
I kind of wish it was.
I know.
Yeah, it's a while ago.
Because I'm like, I know I'm in my mid-40s, but I'm like, and I actually remember when this album came out, because the 90s for me, like the 90s and the early 2000s, I still reach for a lot of the music and the movies and the television that were out at that time, because it was just a unique blackness and a unique Black agency that I don't think exists today. Like we have like Living Single and Girlfriends was out at that time, and like the music band, not the show with the white people. I love the show, but the band Arrested Development. There was just so much going on with a unique Black agency at that time. So my question is, so this album, unfortunately, still remains relevant. I think even more so in this time, considering all of the racism and the police brutality, and now when we have the environmental crisis and what we saw with classism around COVID-19. It came out in 1990, yet it feels like it speaks to several generations, particularly those of formative ages. So like, for example, I was a preteen when it came out. I feel like now this album speaks to like people probably from ages 10 to 25. And I was around 10 when the album came out, and it really spoke to me. I was fortunate to come from a very politically engaged family. Like I come from very blue collar. Everybody was in a union. Everyone in my family were officers in their union. They voted. Like they were just very, very engaged in the work and in the community. So me listening to the album and having access to it landed with me quite differently, and it does now. So why does this album remain relevant, and what do you think are some key takeaways for today's teenagers and young adults who are or seek to be involved in social change? Like, for example, I can hear a lot of the young people who were a part of like March for Our Lives and the Black Lives Matter movement reaching for this type of album.
Yeah. I think that this record, well, okay, so why does it remain relevant? Yeah, it remains relevant because, history, as we all know, repeats itself, and some things just, change is very, very incremental. And sometimes things just don't change. So sadly, a lot of the things that they were, again, sounding the alarm about, like particularly in thinking about the environmental crisis, people weren't really listening. A lot of people still aren't listening now. And so, these things just either are changing at a glacial pace or not changing much at all. So yeah, a lot of this does remain relevant. And as I said, a lot of this record is also future oriented. So I think there's a lot here for young people because it is also speaking to things that you can kind of connect to right now in this generation, or, the generation right before this one. And, so again, thinking about stuff like, the overwhelm of the internet, this wisdom in treating your life like it's special and recognizing that, the path you're on is the path you're on, and not as a young person where there's so many pressures, particularly around social media, as we know with girls in particular, and wanting to, have what your peers have or look a certain way and all this stuff. I mean, I think that last song speaks also and kind of anticipates that where we are right now is with young people. In terms of the more sort of overtly political social justice stuff on the record, these were young men. I mean, I was reminding myself earlier in because my first chapter of the book is biography, because there isn't really a biography on this band, which is Criminals. So the first chapter is biography and kind of letting the reader understand how they were raised, how they became so politically conscious, what their family lives were like, how they engaged music. And I think you get a really strong sense of how those young people became those four thoughtful, well-educated young men. But when they arrived and had all that success, 3 of the 4 members were 24 years old. Vernon Reid was the oldest. He was 30, because Vernon Reid had been around before and already had a reputation, a legendary guitar player before this band. So these are young people who were thrust into the spotlight and made to be, the spokespeople for people. And while it might have been trying at times to have to answer the same questions over and over and over again about being a Black rock band, I can't think of a better group of young men to have done this work, because they were so smart and educated about the issues, and really thoughtful, and the best spokespeople for these ideas. So what I would say to young people: listen to the lyrics of this record. There's a lot of wisdom in the lyrics. There's a lot of wisdom even within the kind of songs about what's happening, the kind of as Public Enemy, right, folks were like the CNN or whatever of hip hop. There's that, but also there's like a lot of wisdom beyond their ages, I think, in the lyrics. A lot of like deep thought about these issues. Their personal activism was through culture because they had a platform and they used it. But they also, I think, were very careful to educate themselves on all the issues first. Very well read, very, very conscientious, right, about really understanding and being thoughtful about how they use their platform. I guess I also just want to say that platforms are not always like you have to be a multi-million selling author, right, to have a platform. It's like, who are the people, where are the communities you're in? Who are the people that, what is your sphere of influence, whether it's a smaller, group of people in the community, or, a stage at MSG, like what's your realm? And just really, taking on, I think, that mantle of engagement and using what platform you have to talk about these issues. And I think that this record is something that can be really useful. Yeah.
Yes, I have the cough. My apologies. So, as a pop culture and literary critic, how have you seen cultural products like popular music evolve to speak of and for generations represented, particularly Black rock, given the lack of autonomy? And this actually came up from last week's episode of Black Writers Read, Given the lack of autonomy that many millennials experience, like growing up amongst two economic recessions, many of them were born post 9/11. We have the COVID pandemic, challenges for buying their first homes and attaining their dream jobs. How do you see young people under the age of 30 connecting to Time's Up?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think really kind of for all the reasons I just said, just I think the relevance of a lot of the lyrics. Um, I think, again, just listening and I've thought about this before, if I were introducing a younger person to Living Color for the first time, and trying to get them to understand how important this band is and what they were saying then and how it's relevant now, I'd probably direct them to Pride. And I would say, just listen to this song and listen to the lyrics. And I'd probably give them the live version on YouTube. There's a live version of them doing it at the Apollo, which I think is really, really important because, the thing I read was all about like feeling alone in my rock fandom as a Black girl growing up. And so it was so gratifying to me to see them on the Apollo. I watched them on the Apollo both times they were on with my mom, and we were both gratified to see them. So I'd probably point them there. But also, so there are a lot of like young people now, and there's like increasing numbers of young Black kids and kids of color who are into hardcore and rock, hardcore and punk rock. And, there's a documentary called Afropunk. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but that came out, I think it was 2007, and it was very good. And then it spawned the festival, the Afropunk festival. But it was a really great documentary where you had all these Black kids who were interested in this music and in these scenes, but mostly feeling alienated, right? But now fast forward to, 15 years later, I can't do math, but fast forward to, however many years later, and you have like young folks. There was just an article in the New York Times just a couple of days ago about young Black and kids of color who are in hardcore punk rock scenes right now, and who are into it, either playing the music or, showing up for the concerts. And, I'm really feeling like this is a book that those kids need to read, and I'm trying to figure out how to get those kids to know about this book because, people are buying the book, but it feels to me, and I could be wrong because I don't know who's buying the book, but the people who reach out to me, the people who review the book, the people who contact me, the people who I know who are writers, they're all around my age. They're all like folks who, were young, like I was 21 when this record came out. They're those people, right? But I would really like to see younger Black rock fans to buy this book, just to have a sense of seeing themselves in the work, and B, to again know how groundbreaking this band is, because they, people hoped that their massive critical and commercial success would open the floodgates and there'd be like a million Living Colors, like so many other, white bands, right? Like white rock bands. It happened with Pearl Jam, and happened with so many other bands where you had all these, like, let's sign another 500 of this band, even if they're not good. But people were hoping that at least some of that would happen with Living Color, and it didn't, and it didn't for a lot of reasons. But what they did do is they cracked the door open a little bit, and and we were able to get a Rage Against the Machine with Tom Morello. We were able to get a TV on the radio. We were able to get a Soundgarden with a person of color in the band. We were able to have William Duvall, who is one of Vernon Reid's mentees. Like, he mentored him early in his career, who's now the lead singer for Alice in Chains, which I'm not convinced that would have happened if it wasn't for Living Color. So I would hope that a young person, particularly a young person who's into rock, a young Black person, could get a lot out of this book and a lot out of this band.
Yeah, and you also speak to, because I was one of those kids who was into different things. Like, but mine, I was classical and jazz, and now it's great to see many platforms that showcase Black classical and jazz artists. So
Mm-hmm.
I love, but it always takes that one person to like break down the door. And then also the other thing too, your response reminded me of, it allowed for crossovers in many ways. Like I believe, and I hope I don't mess up his name, Hootie's real name, Darius Rucker.
Yeah.
I feel like, yeah, if it weren't for, I'm not gonna lie, I feel like Living Colors crossover opened the door so people like Darius Ruckus can do Hootie and the Blowfish, and now is blowing up as a country artist.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, there's been such a powerful reclamation in recent years of country music as Black, right? And it's been really powerful, really public in the media. And I'd like to see that with rock too. And I know that part of it is because even though, what's most, I think, popular on the charts or in streaming right now is hip hop and pop music kind of more broadly, right? But country still, has its own kind of, popularity within Nashville and other certain spaces. And rock just doesn't have that mainstream status anymore. So that could be part of the reason. But I think that that's important, especially because rock for so long, and even still, and I had this conversation with someone recently, even though it's not mainstream right now, doesn't have quite the visibility, it's still as a structure, given because it's a boomer, and I'm a Gen Xer, right? So I'm the kid of a boomer. So rock, I grew up most of my adult life with rock being the be all end all. But it's still, there's a structure, I think, in our culture where there's still a comparison in terms of like how people engage writing about music or how people engage thinking about music, where rock is still, a blueprint, for better or for worse. And I think you see this, and this is a little bit of a side, I'll keep it really quickly, but like when Get Back came out, and on Disney Plus, and you had that moment where all the media was, and I love the Beatles so much, I'm such a huge Beatles fan. And I was one of those people where I watched like all 500 hours of the Get Back, like I'm exaggerating. It wasn't 500 hours, but it was like, might as well have been 500 hours, and I watched all of it and give me all the bonus material. But there was just this moment where so many people were paying attention. It was all over the media because it was like Beatles footage, and people could go back to that and relive that. So anyway, yeah, I think that it's helpful for young people who are maybe, in that punk rock show or in that hardcore show, and not seeing a whole lot of people who look like them, to know about Living Color if they don't, and to know that there are other fans out there like them.
Yeah. So I have a couple of questions that's going to transition us into your career and how you arrived to now, and then we'll wrap up. I know we're a little over an hour already. Since the start of your academic career, how has your writing and literary voice evolved, especially as a Black woman author who writes across multiple genres?
Yeah. So I was somebody who always wanted to be a writer since I was a kid, and I was very clear about that. I knew I was interested in writing about music, in part because I had music magazines all around my house. In addition to my mom listening to rock music, she also had like Cream and Rolling Stone and Trouser Press and Relics and all these rock magazines around the house. So I knew that at some point I wanted to write about music. So before I went back to get my Ph.D., I had started working as a music critic / journalist. And so I was doing that and writing, record reviews and concert reviews. And eventually I was writing for an industry, like a national industry trade. And so I was doing like interviews with like, record label people and interviews with bands. And so I was doing this for a number of years. And then I went back to get the PhD at UCLA. And I also somewhere in there, started working, I had the M.F.A. in creative writing, and I started working on a memoir. So by the time I was at UCLA and it was time to do my dissertation, and I talk about this in the acknowledgments in my first book because it's really, really relevant to why I'm here, why I'm still in academia. My then chair of my dissertation committee, who was my advisor and had been my advisor my entire time in the department, Richard Yarborough, who I always want to shout out because he's amazing. He said to me, completely unprovoked, and I wouldn't have had the guts to ask, because of the way academia has historically been around, this stuff we were talking about earlier, right? Like, what's considered to be rigorous scholarship? Well, it needs to be objective. Well, it needs to be one thing. It needs to be narrowly focused. It needs to be all this stuff, right? So I wouldn't have dared ask. But he said, when you're thinking about a dissertation topic, don't feel like you have to have your music writing over here and your, interest in memoir over there and your literary studies over here. Like, if you can find a way to bring them all together and it works, then you can do that. And I was like, I can? Like, really? And that's all I needed. And so my first book, the dissertation that eventually became the first book, was that, it was marrying all these things together. And it ended up being about, blues people, both real and fictional, making themselves, inventing and reinventing themselves through autobiographical fictions. Like, that's what the book is about. So I was able to bring in autobiographical narrative. I was able to bring in, music. I was able to have literature all together. So that set the stage for the first book, and really my whole career in academia is that, it's pulling from all these different things. My creative writing, which a lot of it ends up being the I, because I'm not a fiction writer, I'm a non-creative nonfiction writer. The music, right? The literature, all of that, and the I, the autobiographical, all tends to be a lot of what my writing is. And I really do credit Richard Yarborough, because not only am I not sure that I would, be on this exact path I'm on if that hadn't happened, but I'm not sure that I would even be in the academy anymore, because I think I would have been just so uninterested that I might have just said, I don't want to do this, and just pursued my other writing. So I'm just really grateful that I've been able to find a way to, again, do work. I'm a serious scholar who does a lot of research and rigorous work on all of the stuff I do. But I appreciate that I have the opportunity to be, multidisciplinary in my work, and also to bring in my own voice at times. It just means a lot.
Yeah, and I want to toast Dr. Yarborough as well, and I hope that everyone that is pursuing it, I have a Dr. Yarborough as well, who's like, we're going to find a way to marry all the things you're interested in together, because that's when you get the most authentic writing, and that's when you get the most productive writing. Is we're not going to fit you in this box. You're going to create your own little playground, and I love that he did that. So thank you, because I think that's why we got the scholar that we have now.
No, thank you.
So we ask all of our guests why they write. Your response to the prompt was this: I write for many reasons. When it comes to my popular music criticism, I'm specifically interested in how people use narratives, stories, and storytelling to reclaim and assert power and agency. I am particularly interested in Black people's stories and how they shift fictive ideas that circulate in American culture about popular music and the artists who create these works. So one reason I write is to correct or uncover incomplete, inaccurate, or hidden histories of American music figures in the 20th and 21st century. What are some popular figures from history that you believe your work authentically captures their contributions to our society? And what have you learned about yourself as an academic, critic, and person of the African diaspora when exploring these stories?
Yeah, thanks. That's such a good question. In my first book, I talk a lot about, again, the ways in which people use narrative and stories and storytelling to kind of correct a record or an autobiographical stuff, like reclaim something and reassert their own agency and power. And so Big Mama Thornton is one of the figures that I talk about in my first book. And Big Mama Thornton, for those who don't know, extremely important 20th century legend, really, blues legend, but also really important to rock music, to rock and roll. She wrote two, well, she wrote one, but she's associated with two of the most important songs in the 20th century. One is Hound Dog. The other is Ball and Chain. So she didn't write Hound Dog, but she did write Ball and Chain. And Hound Dog was written for her, was written with her in mind, with her voice and her affect in mind. And then, of course, she had a version of Hound Dog that came out in the middle of the 50s that did well. You know, it sold well, did well on the rhythm and blues charts. And then Elvis Presley remade the song, and then it did even better. And of course, got into the mainstream. And, you know, in other words, a whole bunch of white people bought Hound Dog. And then, of course, he made a lot of money. And no one really made a lot of money on the Big Mama Thornton version, including Big Mama Thornton. And then Ball and Chain, she wrote, and then it was covered by Janis Joplin and Big Brother and the Holding Company. And that's like the song that actually broke Janis Joplin out at the Monterey Film Fest, at the Monterey concert. And an important difference is that Janis Joplin like went out of her way to make sure that Big Mama Thornton got royalties, that, you know, went out of her way to make sure that she didn't erase her, that people knew where the song came from. Janis Joplin was a true appreciator of the music. Nonetheless, Janis Joplin's success with the song still overshadowed Big Mama Thornton's contributions there. So in the early 70s, she spent a lot of time recuperating her own place and image and importance to not just blues history, but to rock history. So in the early 70s, she did a lot of in concert performances, in documentaries, really talking about and asserting her own involvement in both of these songs, and claimed both of those songs as songs that she wrote. She felt like she had written Hound Dog because of what she brought to it musically, right? So she claimed ownership. So she spent a lot of time in the early 70s, you know, when she'd be on stage, you know, about to perform these songs, like particularly with Ball and Chain. This is a song that I wrote, you know, and she would like do that over and over again, and she'd rehearse it every time. This is a song that I wrote, and it was made famous by me and Janis Joplin, you know, like, so this is like what she would do. And it was very, very effective. And even when she would talk about Hound Dog and her ownership, it was so effective that, you know, Alice Walker ended up writing a short story called 1955 that is kind of based on Big Mama Thornton and Hound Dog. And so I talk about that. And then I, you know, in the book I'm currently working on about rock critics and an all, you know, like a counter narrative, and really showing that this idea that rock critics who created rock criticism were all straight white men is inaccurate. So there's a Black woman rock writer named Cynthia Dagnall Myron who I interviewed for the book and who I talk about in the book. So these are the things that are really important to me, is going back and rethinking what we all think we know about you know, certain cultural movements and moments and people.
Yeah, and I'm so excited for the next book, and here's why. So this past spring, I taught a class, Contemporary Playwrights of Color, and we read an adaptation of Henrik Ibsen's A Doll's House.
Mm-hmm.
And I learned from that, and my students learned from that, and I had mostly theater majors, that Henrik Ibsen's A Doll's House was inspired by a woman author who she's not necessarily invisible, but a lot of her work isn't accessible. My students and I, we were enraged. We were like, okay, so Ibsen became famous on the back of this woman, and not only on the back of a particular woman, but she was ill at the time when he stole the story.
Oh.
And still yet to acknowledge it. And I'm just like, yo, white people, like, can y'all not colonize everything? I'm just like, can y'all just not? Like, can you just take a moment and be like, yeah, so I did this. But at the same time, there's this whole, and this is a whole other episode where there's this whole notion of the scarcity where I can't have, like, if you have, I can't have. And so I think this is why there's that whole lack of acknowledgement and this whole
Yeah.
lack of community. And
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
pull up my bootstraps and nobody else helped me get here. And I'm like, so
Right.
I'm so excited for your next book because of that, of acknowledging people who do a lot of hard work who tend to get erased. Because
Yes.
I know for a fact, because like in terms of like reading Rolling Stone and the Village Voice and all of that,
Mm-hmm.
the white male critics got such high accolades. And I'm like, I know
Mm-hmm.
that's all out there. I'm like,
Yeah.
come on, really?
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And so much of it also with that book, what I've been discovering is a lot of this does have to do with canon formation, right? So it's like canon formation for what's considered rock, and then canon formation by the same folks who decided what's considered rock, they also decided what's considered legitimate rock writing. And so there is, historically, there's been a focus on like the Rolling Stones and Creams and the Village Voice, like regional papers from big cities, and so women and Black folks and other folks of color who were working for, like, I don't know, teen magazines, right? Or groupie magazines or Black and brown newspapers or dailies, that weren't focused on rock. These folks were kind of ignored and erased, because they also weren't in the canonized publications, right? And even the folks who were in the canonized publications still ended up erased, or at least marginalized, right? So yes, excited about the book. And that book, by the way, is a mix of course, archival research, right? Like finding the stuff, but also I've interviewed, at this point, I still have more to go, but I've interviewed something like, I don't know, like 60 or 70 people so
Wow.
far, yeah, of like rock writers who are still with us. Yeah.
Nice. And I love that you said rock writers who are still with us, because
Yeah.
there are still a plethora of many.
Yes.
And I would like to wrap up our time together with this question. So you mentioned your book and you're transitioning, excuse me, to the University of Toledo, which, by the way, since the season started, I've been dealing with a COVID cough because I got COVID in September.
Oh no.
Um, what is next for you, and how can the Black Writers Read community support you on this journey?
Yeah, no, thanks for that. Right. So that book is what's next. And also there's another book that hasn't, I'm at the early stages, but that's thankfully taking me to the kind of like straight creative nonfiction side of my work. So I'm developing a memoir that's music based, so a music memoir. So that's something that I'm in the beginning stages of developing. So that's a project that's a little more down the line. But the rock criticism book is the one that I crossing my fingers will be done with in 2024. It's under contract with Bloomsbury, so it's been under contract a while, but had to put it aside to work on the Living Colored book.
Thank you.
So yeah,
And
again, helping. Like, I'd love to come back on the show.
yeah, because season 5, one of the things I want to do, because many of the authors that we've had on are publishing second and third books since they've been on, and I would definitely love to do and bring back guests who have published again. The difference is season 5, and I think I said this on social media a couple of weeks ago, I'm going to try to go on the road with each episode and do it live in person. So
Wow. That's ambitious and very cool.
Yeah, I'm like, I'm gonna start fundraising soon, but it's gonna happen because I try to do at least one episode a season live, and it just
Mhm.
live and also with an audience, and it resonates and hits a lot differently when we have people in person.
Mhm.
So I'm excited, and I hope to make it out your way. I haven't been to the Midwest since 2018, so
That would be great. That'd be
yeah.
fantastic.
So Kim, I'm gonna wrap us up. Thank you so much for spending your afternoon with us, and I'm excited to get this book in hand, also your first book, and then also your third book, which I'm the minute it's ready to go, I'll be like, Kim, hi, when do you want to come back?
Great, great. I look forward to that.
Cool, thank you so much, and I will talk with you soon.
Okay, thank you. I feel better.
Thank
Bye.
you. Sorry, I had to get a little bit of coughing out before wrapping up today. So, thank you so much for supporting Black Writers Read in season 3. This is the last episode live live stream of the season. I'm beyond grateful for the community that grew this season. For those who, excuse me, are newer to this world, this is the first season that we did both a live stream and an audio podcast. And this is thanks to the people who contributed during excuse me, this cough. I'm so tired of it. And many of you have joined me this season, have been with this cough. So hopefully by next season it'll be done. Um, there was an Indiegogo campaign that launched actually, I think this time last year, where we fundraised to be able to expand the platform. The platform continues expanding, including the virtual book clubs, which I hope people join us. I do. I'm going to share the website one more time. um it's my so you can go to my website and then go to Black Writers Read, and there's a link there that will take you to sign up. There's a different book each month, and it's excuse me, past guests of Black Writers Read. So Black Writers Read, the live stream will be back in season 4 in early September. So please be sure to follow on Instagram at Black Writers Read or my website, NicoleMYoung.com, for more information on the future dates and also to sign up for the virtual book club, which we still have some spots remaining for our first session, excuse me, which is with Enzo Salon Seren, who was on a couple of weeks ago to talk about his book American Scapegoat, which is poetry. Please sign up because spots will fill up really fast, as I want to keep the book club sessions intimate so that people will have a chance to really interact with the author. Be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel to keep up with episodes of both Black Writers Read and my other projects. I'm actually working on not only finishing my dissertation, yes, it's still lingering, but I have a couple of collaborations, beautiful collaborations that are happening this summer, and I will be posting those on my YouTube channel as well. Also, be sure to subscribe to the audio podcast, which is available on Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Amazon Music. So, I can't believe this is the last time I am saying this until September. Thanks to all of our viewers for spending your afternoon with us, and more importantly, for ensuring that Black authors continue to matter. Have a great summer.